It seems the old season was more heavily weighted, or at least not as heavily weighted in January. And so I know, like we've discussed, the Mississippi Flyway for duck hunting, generally speaking, it seems it gets better as the year goes on in January. So since it was not so heavily weighted in the past toward the end of January, do you feel like some hunters might have said, well, I can't really hunt the time the best migration is, so maybe I'm not going to do this? Or I guess my better ask the question, does the migration get better through January, or are we hitting the prime migration, the average prime migration time in the old season?
That's a good question. In mild winters, birds will delay their migration. We saw that this very past year. As far as hunter behavior, it's hard to predict that. There's a lot of things that compete for folks' time, regardless of weather or even bird numbers. I think one of the key points is that these birds are on private lands, so without access, you can drive around all day, and if you can't find the right farmer, you're not going to be able to actually hunt the birds. My understanding from talking to the folks in the region, that the interest is very high in the region, and there's a great sort of a culture being established for crane hunting. So regardless of the fact that it has been early, which is true, early in the fall, folks are out there hunting, they're enjoying it, and they're continuing to hunt year after year. Again, this culture, sort of beginning of a culture there.
I know many things affect the migration, but generally speaking, what would be the average best 2 weeks of the migration in our area?
Well, given that January is colder than December, I think you're safe to say that in a typical year, you'd probably have more birds in January than November or December, early December for sure.
Mr. Chairman, I'd call for the question then on the amendment that's before us at this point.
Just point of order, we wanted to give the commission as a whole a chance to ask questions during this as well as the public, so.
Okay.
I believe
I
you're
thought
calling
we
the
were in
question on
committee
committee.
on this one.
You're on committee on this
And
one.
I was trying to get it out to the
I
full
understand.
commission, so.
Thank you.
Okay.
Just for clarification, Commissioner Cox, your amendment basically, since we can only have one split, if I'm saying this correctly, we would lose the first 2 days. The early, we would be closed, and then it'd be open.
58 days, and we back up to January the 29th and lose 3 days. I'm guessing that's as early as we could open. If we open the first 2 days of the duck season, we would not be able to close for the spring festival. Is that correct?
Let me try to explain it slightly different. Waterfowl seasons, are 60 days, and you're allowed to have a split. Those days do not count against your 60-day season. The crane season is completely different, and essentially you have a 60-day season, and if we have a split, those days come out of our 60-day season. Okay, the way the Tennessee Hunt Plan is written, again, it's been approved by 2 flyways in the federal government, is a 58-day season. So essentially, we do have in front of us if we wanted to have the most hunting days, this is what we should have. Because if we had, essentially right now on the books, we have the split for waterfowl season is on the books as an open season. Again, we have 37 hunt days in Tennessee, but the split counts towards those days in the federal framework. So it's kind of confusing, but we're not able to, we would never be able to, let me just say it this way, we would never be able to have the opening weekend around Thanksgiving and then have all the rest of the days at the end of the season, again, because those days in between count against those 60 days. So this right here is the maximum we'd be allowed to have.
Had the feds not changed the date by the deadline that you?
Excuse me, Commissioner Cox.
I'm sorry.
We had a motion for call for question on the committee, and I think that needs to be seconded and acted upon first. My apologies. Then we can. This was strictly for committee discussion that we will have commission.
Parliamentary inquiry.
Please.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think given that the public hasn't had a chance to comment, would Mr. Ripley consider removing his call for the question?
Sure, I was just trying to get it out of committee, get it to the point where we're looking at it as an entire commission, and then I'd understood that we would have the comment. But yeah, that's fine. I withdraw that.
Thank you, Chairman Woodson. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
I had a continuation question for Mr. Benedict. Had the feds not changed the date for you to to make application or whatever to change what we had, what you're going to recommend next year probably would have been recommended this year.
Yes, sir. And it
So
would
we
be-
would be going to 1,200 permits and these dates.
That's correct. We would recommend a 3-day closure that was your amendment as well. So this would be the season that we'd recommend next year during an operational season, and including a 3-day closure.
What I'm saying is if they hadn't changed the date, this recommendation would have been made this year.
That's correct.
So let me clarify. We can't, sorry, I'm slow, but, so we can't, the committee, I mean, the agency's wanting to wait till next year because at that time, then we have the ability to make it statewide also, correct?
That's correct.
And so what we're really saying here, do we want to change things twice or just once?
Right. If
Okay.
if I may, the other part of the agency recommendation, again, this is premature. We've not been through our season-setting process, but the group that met in December is I'm fairly confident that the agency recommendation would be to keep the 1,200 permits that are currently in that zone, keep those there. In other words, figure out a way to make those valid only in the hunting zone, the current hunting zone. The additional permits, which were reflected here, would be valid statewide. And there's still some discussion, but it could be that we issue them one at a time. In other words, if someone is drawn for a statewide crane permit, they would be issued one permit. Again, that's probably the most up in the air piece of this, because the idea would be to distribute the opportunity wider, because once you get away from the crane zone, cranes are scattered and it's kind of an opportunistic thing. If you're in Jackson in a duck blind and you have a crane fly over, chances of shooting 3 are fairly slim. Whereas if you're in the crane zone, the current crane zone, and you're on a field with agricultural damage, harvesting 3 is a lot greater percentage. So that would be the only additional thing. And something I didn't put in the slide as far as the rationale is, we'd be increasing the permits to 775 in the zone, and then the recommendation, again, perhaps, most likely will be to take those permits away from the zone and move them into the statewide. So we didn't want to confuse hunters by changing it this year. They start to get used to it, and then we change it again next year. So it's certainly an option, to make this recommendation, and then, again, just shift it next year.
I agree entirely with Commissioner Teague's opinion that we don't set seasons based on public sentiment. If we did that, we probably wouldn't have any hunting seasons. And so when I was involved, I was chairman, and obviously Trey was my wildlife chairman. We made the decision to do this, and we did go from the maximum amount that the feds would allow us down to, I believe, is it 400? And then the first year or two, we had more applicants. I called and got one, there was some leftovers. And then, so we're really not having that many more people apply. So I don't understand, in just my opinion, that I think that if we're going to hit this thing with a statewide next year, my opinion is just to wait and do it all at one time.
Audience. I'm going to open this up to the committee discussion, correct? Or do I need to, commission discussion, full commission discussion before?
I hate to be a pain on this, but because it's committee, and because this is a new process, and I appreciate the chairman's call to let the committee act as a committee, I think that these moments are a bit precedent-setting. And since all of the members of the commission are here, I think that they will have the opportunity to hear from the public when they give their comments. But as a member of the committee, I would like to hear from the public before we take a vote and before we move forward, if that's okay. And I would love to hear, actually, from Mr. Butler and any other members of the public who might want to comment on this issue. So, Mr. Chairman, this is totally your call, but I would feel more comfortable if I had an opportunity as a committee member to hear from the public before I vote.
Absolutely. I'll open it up for public Director Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to have to leave shortly, but I just wanted to go back and answer a couple of the questions were asked about the original season setting on the crane season, and some of y'all were there, obviously. as Joe said, the number of permits are based on winter counts. And at the time we were going through our first season, we had an unusually high number in one year. And because of that, there were a lot of concern from the public that the cranes initially, whether that was there or not, would be over-harvested. And it was one of the reasons that the commission at the time said, this is experimental season, so let's set a lesser number of days and lesser permits to make sure that we're giving the public the idea that we're very judicial about going through our season-setting process and protect the game and the wildlife. And that's the reason primarily that was cut back, was because of the counts that we had were based on some high numbers. Since then, we found that, as Joe said, the population has grown. There's no concern there now, but that was to give the public that level of confidence that they would not be over-harvested. The second point, moving on to the number of permits, when we discussed this in staff for quite some time, if you move forward on the number of permits and increasing them, I would just ask that you give us an opportunity to give you some framework about how that would be distributed, because our concern was that if we put all the permits in the hunt zone that we have now, and we come back next year with a statewide season and move those out, the perception would be from those folks in that area that their number of permits had been taken away and been lessened than what they had this year. On the other hand, if you put the whole number of permits out statewide, and a lot of people draw without an expectation of really having a place to hunt, then you won't have the pressure in that hunt zone that you need in that particular area. So I just say that to say that if we change the number of permits, we don't necessarily have to know that right now, but going forward, we'll have to adjust how those permits are distributed, or we run the risk of either taking permits away next year or not having enough permits in the zone that we need them for.
So you're saying if we do 775 this year, that you'd like to keep those in the crane zone, and then the other 425 or whatever it is, you could go statewide with next year?
Yes, sir.
Right, no, yeah.
How many permits are we, I know that says 775 in our current hunt plan. How many will we have next year?
It's actually, I referred to the Eastern Crane Hunt Plan, and there's a formula for how we calculate that.
Yeah.
It's using the 5-year average of the Tennessee midwinter counts, and actually the number I think would be 773, so it'd be slightly less than this year. This year's winter count was down, so that brings that 5-year average down a little bit, but essentially nearly the same.
So we're not gonna get any more than those 775 three bird packets.
Correct, for next year, right. And if I may speak to the last question to the director, again, this is premature, but I think what staff recommendation would be to keep the 400 permits in the crane zone, again, for next year for operational, and these additional 375 would be distributed statewide. Again, we're premature on that. I just want
And we're guessing on what the recommendation for permits will be next year. Next year's count will be included in that as well, or this year's winter count?
this year's winter count will be, but I calculated those numbers, and I believe it's 773. I forgot to look at that yesterday. I calculated that about a month ago.
I'm sorry, I'm confused now. Where did you said next year the recommendation is going to be 1,200? You said 1,200 permits. So,
It's likely when we go operational that we'll recommend that 1,200 permits out of this 2325 total would stay in the hunt zone, and the rest of those, I can't do math up here, but the other about 1,000 permits would be issued statewide. It goes to the
A little
direct,
confusion, because the permit right now is
Packets.
3, so it's a packet.
right.
It's a little
We're only going to
Clerical.
775 packets.
775 packets
Right.
are going to be available,
Right.
correct?
Versus 400 currently available.
Okay, and with 3 permits per packet, that's where we get to the 2,300 figure, correct?
Yes.
Okay, would one possibility then be if we increase the total number of packets this year to 775, to keep the same number of packets available in the current hunt zone and make the rest statewide?
We cannot do that this year. The hunt plan that's approved by the Fed says you'll have a hunting zone and a non-hunting
I
zone.
see, so they'd all have to be, okay.
But next year, I think the agency proposal will be exactly what you stated. Keep the 400 or 1,200, 400 packets, 1,200 permits in the zone, and all the rest will be statewide.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments from the audience?
Your audience.
Mike
You're more
Butler.
than that, Mr. Butler, let me assure you, but it's your time.
I just wanted to offer, Mike Butler, Tennessee Wildlife Federation, I wanted to offer some historical perspective. Our board was the one that brought the resolution that they passed to the commission 5 years ago, or 6 years ago, to start the process to create the season when Chairman Chase was chairman of the commission. And I would point out, we would support this expansion for these reasons. Number one, had by no power or fault of our own, or the commission or the agency, the timeline was shifted on us by the federal government. So I think it is valid, the points made, that we would be doing these things right now, right here, for this coming hunting season, had the agreement we made with the public been kept by the feds. They moved the cheese, so it just changes the timeline on it. And we consider that technical. But I think we feel like the agency has met the commitment to the public that was made when that deal was done back then. The second point that we would point out is that what's been great, as we predicted under the science that was put into this proposal, there's been no impact to the crane population. We knew that going in. It hasn't happened. It hasn't affected the viewing festival. The only thing that's been affected by the current structure is hunters are missing the opportunity because the season doesn't run later, and we saw last year the weather affect that season drastically. The third thing that we would point out is that the demand for permits has in fact gone up. The first year in that zone at the draw, 253 permits were pulled. The balance of the 400 permits from that were spread out amongst the 4 regions, and they sold out by 10 o'clock that morning. They were gobbled up across the rest of the state. Last year, all 400 permits were taken on site, and there were none available for the rest of the state. So you saw, in fact, 150-person increase in demand on site. I think if we put these 775 out there, obviously drawing and using are 2 different things. I think you will see probably the same amount of demand locally, but when you put those out to the satellite regions to provide our sportsmen opportunity to come to that region and bring that attraction there, I think we'll see those permits get gobbled up at the regional offices like we did the first year when we had a few surplus ones. And in closing, we would strongly support the 3-day closure for the festival. Having been an organization that sponsored that festival for a decade, and the organization that brought forth the concept of the season, that is an incredibly important festival, and I think having an extra day to buffer that would be really important, if anything, just out of sensitivity for it. So that's all I had. Just wanted to touch on that.
I have one question. We're given these 3-day permits. If this thing grew, and do you think our total number of birds is to be harvested is going to be 2325 like you have up there right now?
For the operational season?
Mm-hmm.
I believe it'll be slightly less than that, and I apologize for not bringing that number. It'll be very close to this.
Right.
What'll happen is every year, just like the waterfowl season, they count the birds and they give us a season. Essentially, every year, the crane population will do those calculations on 5-year averages, and this number could adjust. There's been some discussion in the agency, do we set a number lower than this, slightly lower, so that in a year when we lose 3 or 4 permits, we don't have to change the number of permits we issue? In other words, just be slightly more conservative for continuity's sake. But again, that'll be up to you. We will always ask the Fish and Wildlife Service for the most number of permits. And what we decide to do with issuing all of them or retain a number like 775 that's a round number would be up to you guys.
I think one thing as a commission we need to think about, if this thing keeps continuing to grow like it is, do we keep that at a 775 number, or do we cut those birds down to 2 birds per permit and go up, and get up to the, $1,200 number to go out to her, so that it gets distributed, throughout the whole thing. It's my only point I want to make on that.
I think that's what he was talking about, next year issuing the excess permits as a one bird per permit. That way it'd spread it out more for the.
As an option to consider, yes, sir.
As I said in the last commission meeting, my family and I have participated in all three hunts. The second year, there were 400 people, and 400 people got grown. The third year was also a sellout. The reason that we requested the date change was there were no birds up until about Christmas. So we had about a 7-day period that we could hunt. And it didn't make a lot of sense because the birds were late coming in. I strongly support that, and I think that if we sell 400 permits and 500 permits that we are growing, which is deer and deer season, you gotta get out and go up there on a Saturday, and give up Saturday, and stand in line and stay there for 4 hours to be drawn. I think that the other permits that are at the agency offices will go unnoticed. It's just my own personal opinion.
As the commissioner at ground zero, since Hiawatha's in my district, first of all, I would like to say, I would be for all of this if we're looking at next year. And the reason being, and here's my points, I don't see why we would make the changes now and then change again next year. We're kicking the dog twice. The other thing is going to Director Carter's comments, if we put the 775 permits into the current zone and then we take them back out, the hunters are going to feel like they're losing something. It's going to be confusing there. And then the last comment is, we haven't, during a comment period, we had a different hunting seasons up, and now we're changing it, and the birders have not had an opportunity to comment on it.
Commissioner Teague, with your permission, we are going to take a 10-minute break. And the sole reason for this 10-minute break is that we have dates flying all over the place. We have number of permits being issued and packets. And we owe it to staff to allow them to take a breath and make sure that they feel good about the numbers they're sharing, because they're getting hit from a lot of directions right now. So if you don't have an objection, Chairman Teague, we'll take a 10-minute break. We will come back. We will still be in committee, and we will still be taking public comment. Thank you.